Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a wonderful turnout, and I don't think you're going to be disappointed at the lecture you're going to hear. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce our lecturer to you. She is my good friend, Judy Machen. However, I've been warned by Judy to keep this short, as she intends to fill every possible minute of her talk, and trust me, we will want her to do that. So briefly, Judy holds degrees from UC Berkeley and was a longtime employee of Lannel, working through the years as a technical editor, an exhibit developer at the Bradbury Science Museum, and a research historian with the lab group that's responsible for all of the cultural sites that are on lab land. Because of her involvement with that group, she was assigned to write the history of homesteading on the Pajarito Plateau. She had co-authors helping Ellen McGee and Dorothy Hoare. The result was this publication that came out a few years ago, Homesteading on the Pajarito Plateau, 1887 to 1942, in case you can't see this in the back. Being a lab-produced publication, this book couldn't be sold. A government publication can't be sold. So in this case, this incredible book was given away. And copies didn't last very long, as you can imagine. There are people who still want copies. The lab is not going to reprint it. So we hope that at some time in the future, though this book isn't in our stable of books coming along, we'd like to put it there. And we're hoping that Bathtub Road Press might be able to do that and come up with a second edition of this. Along that line, if there is anyone in the audience tonight with about $10,000 burning a hole in your pocket, please see me after the lecture. Think itemized deduction. Drawn in deeper and deeper into the history of homesteading by her work on this book, Judy has continued to research our homesteading history on her own. She will be sharing this evening some of the amazing information that she has collected to enhance this history. Please welcome our own Judy Machen.
I am delighted to be here tonight to talk to you about what I usually think of as Los Alamos's hidden history. It's homestead history, hidden because it has been overshadowed by the ranch school history and by the Manhattan Project history. And my plan tonight is to unwrap that homestead history for you, that secret history, and I hope to bring the homestead era alive for you, not by using facts and figures, but through the stories of these through two homesteaders. This is David Romero, and this is Harold Brook. And we'll be learning quite a bit about them this evening. And I've chosen these two men for very specific reasons, which I will soon reveal. And everything that I will be sharing with you tonight is new. Things that we have learned since the Homestead book was written. So, you know, often when I talk to people, they know about the Manhattan Project. Some have heard about the ranch school era, but almost no one says, when I say, what do you think about, when you hear the words Los Alamos, almost no one says homesteading. But there were indeed homesteaders on the Pajarito Plateau, beginning in 1887, when Juan Luis Garcia, the patriarch of this family, filed for the very first homestead tract here, up in the northern part of the Pajarito Plateau. And in telling these stories tonight, I have two goals. And my first goal is to convince you that homesteading here on the Pajarito Plateau is more interesting and has had more of an impact on our community than you might imagine. And my second goal tonight is to argue that homesteading here on the plateau differed significantly from the stereotype that we have of homesteading at the national level. So let's start by looking at this timeline. Homestead era on the Pajarito Plateau lasted 55 years. You can see it begins in 1887. That's when Juan Luis Garcia first filed for his tract. And it was, after 30 years, it was overlapped by the ranch school. So I think you can all see Homestead era, the green line, blue line, the ranch school, and both of them came to a very abrupt ending when Project Y took over the plateau. So, homesteading left a physical impact on the plateau. And in this image, the aerial photo shows all the homesteads. The pond is about here. And here on the topo map, these farms are overlain on our plateau, and this is Los Alamos there. And almost all our neighborhoods in the town site were once homesteaded land. And I did just point that out, didn't I? There's Los Alamos to orient you. But about half the homesteads were on what is now laboratory land. And in fact, the main administrative area is on what was once the Duran homestead. But as for the other half, the part that's open to the public, most of our neighborhoods and schools, our hospital, urban park, the golf course, the stables, the cemetery, are located on what once were homesteads. And that is why the homestead era is important to us. It was the homestead era that determined the shape of Los Alamos. Now, as I just mentioned, I'm claiming that homesteading on the Pajarito Plateau had some unusual characteristics, and it did not in many ways follow the typical scenario experienced by most of our national homesteaders. And I'm going to use the stories of David Romero and Harold Brook to substantiate my claim. But first, we need to talk very briefly about the national homesteading experience so that, as I make my argument, you can compare and contrast the national experience with what I will be telling you about our experience here. Now, does anyone recall when the Homestead Act was signed? Mrs. McDougall does. It was signed back in 1862 by Abraham Lincoln. And that act allowed people to claim up to 160 acres of land virtually free. And why was the Homestead Act created? There were two major reasons. Now, recall that America was a nation of small, independent farmers in the mid-1860s. The sturdy yeoman, so admired by Thomas Jefferson, was the backbone of our country. And the goal was to give people enough land to allow them to be self-sufficient and ideally to produce some cash crops so that they could pay their taxes and buy whatever they couldn't make or grow themselves. But there was another major reason behind the Homestead Act. It was an effort to open up settlement in the western United States because western expansion was seen as key to national survival. So what did you have to do to become a homesteader? You had to be a citizen of the United States, at least 21, male or female, and you had to begin improvements within 6 months of entering a claim. And improvements meant building a home and clearing the land and planting crops. And one's homestead was to be one's permanent home. And originally, claimants had 5 years to fulfill these requirements. And we can use Laura Ingalls Wilder's books to depict the national stereotype of homesteading. I'm sure some of you grew up reading these books as I did. Young people leaving all they had known, their families and their communities, courageously heading west to start a new life, to become independent, to help open up our country. They lived year-round on their homesteads through summer heat and winter blizzards, often in isolation on their tracks, far from the nearest town. But with a few exceptions, that's not how it happened here. So now let's let David Romero and Harold Brook tell the story of homesteading as it occurred here on the plateau. And I want to begin with this map because the lives of both David Romero and Harold Brook were centered on the Pajarito Plateau. So I hope you can read this in the back. Here's Los Alamos, and the area open to homesteading was the central area. Note particularly the boundaries in red. This is the Baca location, which was established by congressional law in 1860. That's 2 years before the Homestead Act. And note also the Ramon V. Hill Grant, which extends along the southern boundary of the land. And here's White Rock, and here's Frijoles Canyon. And I want you to pay particular attention to the Ramon V. Hill grant because it plays a very important part in the story of both our homesteaders. The Ramon V. Hill grant is the later name for a Spanish land grant that was given to one Pedro Sanchez in 1742. And so pay attention to the grant. Now, these two men, David Romero, you know which one he is. He looks so grim, but it's the only photograph we have of David or his wife. So you're going to be seeing it a few more times. And Harold Brook. Now, they lived lives on the Pajarito Plateau that in many ways could not have been more dissimilar. They represent two very different approaches to homesteading here. And yet they both, and all persons who became homesteaders in the United States, had to follow the same regulations. But as we will see, both men stretched those regulations in different ways. So let me introduce to you formally David Romero. Here he is. He was one of the earliest homesteaders in our part of the plateau, the southern part. And he applied for his homestead in 1893 when he was 50 years old. Now, why have I chosen David Romero as one of my subjects? Well, for several reasons. To begin with, he represents the majority of the families who homesteaded here on the plateau. Now, I know you can't read this, and don't try, but of the 38 people who successfully obtained their patents, their deeds, for their tracts, 30 were Hispanos, and only 6, well, they're the names in black. The names in yellow are of the only 6 Anglo homesteaders who tried to earn their living here. There were actually 8 who won their patents, but 2 did it by a different means and never stepped foot on the plateau. So the second reason that I've chosen to tell you about David Romero is, of course, because it's the Romero cabin that symbolizes the homestead era on the plateau. And of course, you know it's right there, and I hope you went over and looked at it today because it was open this afternoon, right? And you could see it, and are the biscochitos still there? They were supposed to lure you over there. So this cabin was moved from its original location in 1985 and has been restored several times. And I want to point out that the Romero cabin is not David's cabin. It is that of his son, Victor. And because David's has disintegrated, Victor had a small 15-acre homestead that was contiguous with and incorporated into David's, and the 2 Romero homesteads were simply farmed as one. Now, I would like to introduce you to Harold Brook. He didn't apply for a homestead until 1908, 15 years after David Romero did. And why is Harold Brook important to our tale? Well, because first of all, he represents the 6 Anglo homesteaders, and in fact, 3 of the 6 became homesteaders because of him. And the second reason is that his homestead has become the historic heart of Los Alamos. right where we are tonight. So now that you have been introduced to these two gentlemen and know why they are particularly important to our history, I'll relate each of their stories so that we can compare and contrast the two. So keep them in mind. And also keep in mind the stereotype of the national homesteading experience and the regulations. So I'm going to start with David Romero. As I mentioned, he was one of the earliest homesteaders in our part of the plateau, applied for his homestead in 1893. But where did he come from? And why did he choose to homestead here on the plateau? So let's take a look at the map of the plateau again. David Romero and all the Hispano homesteaders came from the nearby Rio Grande Valley. And this is one of the characteristics that makes our homestead history distinctive. Most, including David, lived right here on the pueblo of San Ildefonso. Here we are, here's Los Alamos, here's San Ildefonso. See that? And what you know is right down the road. And David and the Hispano homesteaders on the plateau lived in the very heart of the Hispano homeland, which is a geographic region centered around Santa Fe. And by 1900, half this area was over 90% Hispano, and 29 of the census precincts were 100% Hispano. Now, Harold Brook, whose tale we will come to shortly, arrived on the Pajarito Plateau during this time in 1906. And I show you this map to demonstrate the world that David Romero lived in and the world that Harold Brook had to adapt to. So David and the other Hispano homesteaders lived only a day's wagon journey away from their permanent homes where they had irrigable farms, so they had permanent homes. Right here, you know this scene all too well, but here we are looking east, and all along the Nambe-Powaki River is where these homesteaders came from. The plateau was virtually in their backyard. Since at San Ildefonso, they had permanent homes and irrigable farms, why did David Romero and his neighbors want homesteads up in the mountains where only dry farming was possible? Our argument, which was first proposed by one of my co-authors, Ellen McGee, is that they wanted to gain something that they had once had, but had lost. In decades past, villagers had free use of the resources of the plateau, and that custom was part of the Hispano homeland homesteaders' cultural heritage, based on Spanish customs and traditions of land use that went back centuries. And the idea was this: subsistence farmers clustered together in villages for mutual support along a water source that made irrigation possible, and there they owned their farmland. And in the photo, do you know the term long lots? Here's San Ildefonso, and here's the Powaki River, and these black stripes are long lots. They're vertical, look vertical from the air, farms, so that positioned this way, so each has access to the river. And you can see that when you're driving through northern New Mexico. So they lived that way, and they could own their own farms, but they used the resources of the surrounding area communally. And of course, the surrounding area here is the Pajarito Plateau. And so the plateau was common land, owned by none and shared by all. And there the community could cut timber, graze their stock, hunt, fish, and of course gather edible wild plants. All of these were opportunities and resources that were vital to the survival of the community. So private land plus communal land made possible the seasonal round. It's a survival strategy focused on transhumance that was centuries old. As soon as there was enough grass up at the higher elevations, stock was moved up to pasture there to fatten up during the summer, and with the onset of fall, and after the harvest, the cattle were brought down, and you can see that. That's a 16th century painting by Brook, which I love, depicting this old custom. And it was so important to the inhabitants of the Hispano inhabitants of San Ildefonso, because these resources on the plateau were crucial to people who lived by subsistence agriculture, and they needed both. But this ages-old custom abruptly ended in 1850, well before homesteading became possible, when New Mexico became a territory of the United States after the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. When New Mexico became an American territory, the plateau, except those two areas privately owned, became part of the public domain. And that meant restrictions on its use. So, from 1850 on, the residents of San Ildefonso were denied use of the plateau. And that meant that the survival strategy of the local Hispanos from San Ildefonso was dramatically compromised. But even though the local Hispanos were now denied access to the plateau, they were still using it, at least part of it. And here's where the Ramon Vigil grant comes in again. Now, legally, the grant had always been off limits, but some, and here it is, remember, and here's Los Alamos, some of the homesteaders, the Hispano homesteaders from San Ildefonso, were descendants of the original Sanchez owner, and they believed they had never lost their right to use the grant. And that's because when, in 1851, the Sanchez heirs sold the grant to Ramon Vigil, 3 of the 11 heirs refused to relinquish their rights. And David Romero's wife, Francisquita Duran from San Ildefonso, was a descendant of one of the 3 holdouts. So David had been using the grant at least since he married Francisquita in 1869, and he knew the plateau well. But the descendants' use of the grant became disputed. So when homesteading became possible on our part of the plateau in the early 1890s, David immediately applied for a tract. In this way, reclaiming legally a portion of his people's ancient communal lands. Now here's David's application to enter a claim, and I think you can see that he signed his name with an X. And so we know he was illiterate. He was 50 years old when he applied and signed that document. But we also know from the censuses that he spoke English as well as Spanish, although his wife did not. So where was David's homestead? He chose a site of 160 acres, the maximum allowed, right on the northern boundary of the tract, right along here. And the Pajarito Road crosses the grant about there and crosses just where David's homestead was. And let's take a look at it. Here is David's homestead, or was. Some of you may remember when Pajarito Road was open, seeing the Romero cabin on the south side of the road. This aerial photo was taken in 1946, shortly after the end of the war. And let me explain it to you. Here's this dirt track became Pajarito Road. So here's David's cabin. Here's his son's cabin. And here's a blow-up of it. You can barely see it. And that's the cabin that's here on the lawn of Fuller Lodge. These are the remnants of their Romero's only close neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. McDougal, who play an important part in the story of Harold Brook. In the background, this is the town site, as it was right after the Manhattan Project in 1946, and these meadows are the sites of other homesteads. David built a one-room cabin on his tract, no doubt similar to his son Victor's. This is Victor's cabin on its original site. And he also built outbuildings such as corrals, a stable, fences, and a reservoir. But neither David's cabin nor that of his son Victor was a permanent home. Doesn't look like one, does it? They were built for summer use only, for shelter when the Romero family came up to the plateau to plant and tend and harvest their crops. David and his family never lived year-round on their homestead. And why would they? For they had permanent homes, a close-knit community, and support systems at Samuel Defonso. They used their homesteads and their homestead cabins only seasonally. Now here's a recent aerial photo of the lab's TA-55. That's the plutonium plant, as you know, overlain with the boundaries of the Romero homesteads. And I owe this map to Jason Romero, no relation to David. Jason is our county surveyor. So this is David's tract in green. Here's Victor's tract, his 15 acres in turquoise. And right there, the green dot is the Romero cabin. The yellow marks the boundaries of the McDougall family. And you can see this red line is the original Pajarito Road, but it had to be relocated, as you see here, when TA-55 was built. And you can see that having been relocated with the plant here, that the Victor Romero cabin would have been destroyed had it not been moved. Okay. The McDougalls lived so close to the Romeros that unfortunately the relationship was quite contentious, but that is another story. It's quite a story. So how did the Romeros farm? They farmed, as one inspector noted, and I quote, by ancient methods that had been in use for centuries, unquote. Labor was provided by the Romero family, including the women and the older children, and the men plowed behind a horse. As you see here, that's not David, but that gives you the idea. On their plateau homestead, the Romeros planted a few fruit trees. Francisquita planted a small kitchen garden. Their major crop was beans, which could be bartered or sold for cash, very important. But the Romeros also grew corn, squash, pumpkins, and peas for their own use to supplement what they grew at their farm at Samuel Defonso. And the iris, by the way, that grow today in front of the Romero cabin here by Feller Lodge are descendants of the same iris that the Romeros planted during their homestead years. Now, farming on the plateau was not easy, as you can imagine if you've ever tried to grow anything here. And the terrain, as we all know, was rugged. They could farm only on the mesa tops. The high elevation meant a short growing season, and only certain crops thrived here. And worse, there was no permanent water supply, which meant that only dry farming was possible. And further, for domestic use and for their animals, the Romeros laboriously had to haul water from the nearby canyon. This photo is not of them, but it also gives you the idea. Now, the person I've described to you so far is David Romero, the homesteader. But who was David Romero, the man? Here he is again. Let me just take a sip of water. It's warm. Earlier genealogists believed that David was the descendant of a Hispano family who settled on San Ildefonso Pueblo land sometime in the 17th century. And that's what we wrote in the Homestead book. And all censuses from 1870 on, and recall that he married Francisquita in 1869, record him as living at San Ildefonso until his death at the end of 1931. And all censuses from 1870 on record his color or race. Those were the terms used by the early censuses as white. Now, the choices in the early censuses included white, black, mulatto, Indian, or Chinese. But we discovered, after our homestead book was published, alas, something surprising about David Romero. And when I say we, I mean my colleague, Jane Clements, who deserves credit and recognition for many of our discoveries. I hope she's here tonight. Jane, are you here? Oh, there she is in the back. Wave your hand, Jane. She's at the far back. Okay. I could not do without Jane. What we found was that David was not the descendant of a Hispano family living at San Ildefonso. And he was not born there. He was a Pewaukee Indian. And Jane found this certificate, which shows, it's in Spanish, so I know you can't read it, but, well, maybe you can read it, but Old Spanish. It shows that he was baptized on January 31st, 1843, age 6 days, born on the Pewaukee Indian Reservation, which is almost immediately adjacent to San Ildefonso. And he is recorded in Spanish as Juan Cristobal David Romero, and as an Indian, Indio, in the original Spanish, and as the legitimate son of Catarina Romero, India, native of the pueblo of Pewaukee, and his godparents are also listed as Pewaukee Indians as well. But the name of his father is left out. Now, think back to your New Mexico history. To whom did what we call New Mexico today belong in 1843? Remember? Yes, Mexico, between 1821 and 1848. Here's an image of the Mexican fight for freedom from the Spanish crown. So David Romero, Pewaukee Indian, began his life as a Mexican citizen, or at least as a resident of Mexico. And the Mexico of David's youth, today's New Mexico, was barely civilized and has been described as, quote, a remote, isolated terminus of Hispanic society lodged in the midst of Indian country, unquote, where Navajo and Apaches frequently raided the pueblos and small Hispanic communities. Now, censuses show that David, his mother, and his siblings lived at Pewaukee Pueblo until 1850 at least, and possibly up to 1860. But they are no longer listed at Pewaukee in the 1860 census. And so where did they go? Well, we looked for a long time, and there is some evidence that Jane has unearthed that show that David and his mother and sibs may have moved to Santa Fe, where David's mother worked as a washerwoman, and David is some sort of servant. But to our great excitement, we did discover where David was in September 1861. He was fighting in the Civil War. Remember, the Civil War came to New Mexico too. At age 18, on September 21st, 1861, David enlisted in Company K of the 3rd New Mexico Mounted Volunteers for a 6-month term. And he brought with him, as required for volunteers, his clothing, his horse, and his equipment, all that he needed. This is the muster-in roll that we found in the National Archives. Now, David was stationed at Fort Craig, which is 120 miles south of Albuquerque. This picture is taken about 1865, and here is Fort Craig, here is Albuquerque, and here is Santa Fe, to orient you. And there, he was somehow involved in the Battle of Valverde, which I won't go through, but we weren't sure just how he was involved when we saw this cryptic notation on David's muster roll. And here it says, down here at the bottom, says, lost his horse. Ugh. So we thought perhaps David had been shot down during a dramatic moment of the battle. But detective work by my colleague Jane showed us how easily assumptions can be wrong. Jane found the true story hidden in this court case, the New Mexico horse cases, 1880. This case was adjudicated 19 years after the battle in 1880, and it revealed how David had lost his horse. Now recall that volunteers had to bring their own, but David's horse was so emaciated that the Army took it away, along with some horses of some of the friends he had enlisted with, and they put the horses out to pasture near Fort Craig to fatten up. And sometime before the Battle of Valverde, the Confederates stole those horses. Now I'm going to digress for just a moment, although I'm supposed to keep this to 1 hour, but I want to show you an excerpt from the court case, which shocked me when I read it. The court case occurred because David and his friends wanted to be compensated for their horses. They had to go to court to do so. So here's an excerpt from the court case, court's reaction. The causes of action come from a remote portion of the country. The witnesses imperfectly speak our language. The amounts involved are trivial. The court sympathizes with the Assistant Attorney General in the difficulty and embarrassment of defending trivial cases after such a lapse of time. Well, I think you see what I mean. These excerpts from part of the formal judgment give us an insight to the attitudes of David Romero's times. But this story illustrates a point I want to make about David. All his life, he struggled to make ends meet. His persistence in trying for years to obtain compensation for his lost horse and his equipment hints that his economic situation always continued to be marginal. He needed that compensation. When the case was finally settled in the plaintiff's favor, David was 37, he had been married for 11 years, and he had 5 young children. And his compensation for his horse was $27.50 plus $10 for the equipment. And of course that was worth more then than it is today. Let's talk briefly about David Romero's family. Here's the marriage certificate, also in Spanish, for David and his wife, Francisquita. And as I mentioned earlier, they were married at San Ildefonso, where Francisquita's family had lived for many generations, and where the two of them lived for the rest of their lives. Now, various censuses report that David and Francisquita experienced as many as 18 or 22 live births. But whatever the actual situation, 5 of their children lived to adulthood. Recall it was their firstborn, Victor, who built the Romero Academy. From censuses and plot maps of San Ildefonso, we found that the Romeros lived in the very heart of the pueblo, right here, near the church. And there they were surrounded by their nuclear family, and Francisquita's parents, her siblings, and her grandfather. And as their own sons grew and married, the maps and censuses show that they too established households right next to or very close to David and Francisquita. Now, what choices for earning a living were open to David Romero? He had no formal education, none at all, and he was illiterate. And so he remained a farmer at San Ildefonso all his life. I was delighted to find this photo, which shows San Ildefonso as it was when David was living there. But David took advantage of whatever opportunities he could. So besides obtaining a homestead on the plateau, he gradually increased his property at San Ildefonso. These are plot maps. Again, I know you can't read it, but they give the names of where every person was living. And he had a number of plots there. So he increased his property at San Ildefonso, and he supplemented his farming in a very interesting way. He was part of his community's health system. He was a respected curandero, a natural healer, and a partero. He was a midwife. And his family recalls his getting calls in the middle of the night. And he was paid, no doubt, in kind rather than cash, because he lived in a barter society. David Romero was a respected leader in his community. Jane has discovered that starting back as far as 1880, when David was 37, he was chosen a number of times over the years to represent his precinct, San Ildefonso, in Democratic Party affairs. He died at San Ildefonso on December 29, 1931, at age 88, a month before his 89th birthday. And according to his death certificate, he had been actively farming through his 86th year. And this headstone stands in the cemetery at San Ildefonso and commemorates his service in the Civil War. Life was never easy for David Romero. He lived a life of scarcity, but he was a survivor. He successfully fed and clothed his family, which included his mother, Caterina, who died at age 90 at San Ildefonso. He gradually improved his circumstances over the years, and he was able to support himself and Francisquita in their old age. And at his death, he still owned land that he could pass on to his wife and children. And by the way, Francisquita outlived him by 13 years. She died in 1944 in her early 90s. Now, to turn to the tale of our second homestead. Let me change. Harold Brook, and to contrast his story with that of David Romero's. As I mentioned, Harold Brook's important to our homestead story for two major reasons. The first being that he represents the 6 Anglo homesteaders who tried to make a living on the plateau. And the second reason is because Brook's homestead is the heart of our historic center. And here's what it looked like. His tract bordered on the eastern edge of Ashley Pond, but it did not include the pond. And after 1917, when Brook left the homestead, the plateau, his homestead became the site of the Los Alamos Ranch School. And this photo is looking east. You know, these are the two roads. This became Central and this became Trinity. Here's where the airport is, and these are the fields of homesteaders. This is the Lujan homestead on North Mesa. And then, after the Army took over the plateau in November 1942, expelling the ranch school and all the homesteaders, the laboratory buildings of Project Y and the housing areas extended over what had originally been Brook's homestead. Can you see? You can see, I think, that here's Ashley Pond, here's Fuller Lodge. And today, much of the center of Los Alamos covers what was once Brook's homestead. He filed for his homestead of 160 acres on August 1st, 1908. His tract is both the purple and also this yellow piece here. Here's Ashley Pond, and here's Smith's to orient you. He was a homesteader only for 9 years, but during those 9 years, this ambitious young man eventually accumulated almost 800 acres of farmland on the plateau. He plunged into commercial farming and ranching. He brought the latest farm equipment to the plateau, and he used the most modern farming methods of his day. He hired numerous ranch hands, mostly Hispanos from the area, and he expanded into cattle and sheep raising. He built the first silo in New Mexico, and he was said to have obtained the first twine binder in northern New Mexico. And this photo shows Brook's farming partner, an Englishman named Macwood Hopper. He's operating the twine binder. Brook was said to have rigged up one of the first steam boiler threshers in the area. And here his workers are using his 12 horsepower steam engine to sort and bag beans. It was a major operation. Brook grew so many beans that he was dubbed the Bean King of New Mexico. He was proud of his accomplishments. He made this claim in a letter to Edgar Hewitt, only 14 months after he had entered his homestead. He said, "I am confident that I have the best equipped farm for modern machinery in this part of New Mexico." And he added, "For this machinery alone, I have spent $2,000. It includes a 12 horsepower boiler engine and threshing machine, the latest McCormick twine binder, the latest riding sulky plow, corn and bean planters, riding cultivators, a disc harrow and a drill, a bean harvester, etc., all new this season, and introduced at enormous expense and hauled over newly worked and prepared roads at infinite labor." And here's an example, you see, of what the early roads looked like. And he also said that he built 500 feet of bridge, probably referring to that one. Brook aggressively increased his holdings. He convinced the itinerant Englishman, Macwood Hopper, here's Hopper to Homestead here, to file for a tract right next to his with the intent and promise to buy Hopper out as soon as Hopper received his deed or his patent, which, by the way, was illegal according to the Homestead Act. And here is Hopper, here is his cabin, and you know the chimney is still exists right over there by the Brooks garden. Here's Hopper looking at his chimney on a visit here in 1951. Brook also convinced Hopper to buy a nearby homestead and then sell it to Brook's mother. And then Brook convinced his mother herself to apply for a homestead, which he formed on his own. He built a home for her, this one, on her tract, that's down on DP Road, but she hated it. She hated the isolation, she hated the cold winters, she hated having to haul water from the canyon below. She preferred to stay with her son. So here she is at Brook's home near Ashley Pond, near Fuller Lodge. Here she is, feeding a lamb on the front porch. Now this map represents just those of Brook's holdings in the center of Los Alamos. He continued to increase his holdings by buying out homesteaders in other places on the plateau. And Brook's original homestead is in yellow. Here again is the pond. This is the Hopper homestead. This is mostly eastern area. This is Maddie's homestead, which included both the airport and then DP Road. In the blue is a piece of property that dates from after Brook's time and belongs to the ranch school. And that does include the pond. Brook's extensive ranch structures included not only a 5-room frame house, as you see here, but also a smokehouse, a chicken house, a barn, sheds, a blacksmith shop, and corrals. He followed the latest scientific agricultural principles. He rotated his crops. He matured his fields. And besides beans, he planted corn, wheat, rye, oats, barley, peas, and spelt. He raised lamb for local markets, which included Denver. And at one moment in time, he was recorded as having 10 head of cattle, 9 horses, 1,300 sheep, and 4 hogs. He was viewed as having the best ranch in the area. And yet, ultimately, Brook failed. He was beset by financial and health problems. And like every other one of the original Anglo homesteaders, he moved on, and all 6 were gone by 1917. So that's Brook the homesteader. But who was Brook the man? This photo was taken of him after he left the plateau. What led Brook to the Pajarito Plateau, and why did he leave it? In our homestead book, we repeated what little was known about Brook at that time. It was thought that he was an agronomist from Illinois who came to New Mexico in search of a cure for his tuberculosis, and that, attracted by the possibilities of farming on the plateau, he'd filed for a homestead on August 1st, 1908, and that he also supported himself by working for a lumber company, a local lumber company. Well, don't you believe what we wrote in the Homestead book? Brook was indeed from Illinois. He indeed was tubercular, and he did indeed make entry for a homestead in 1908. But Brook was not a full-fledged agronomist, although he had gone to agricultural school for 2 years. He did not seek out New Mexico specifically in hopes of a cure for his TB. He did not come to the Palomito Plateau with the intent of homesteading. And once here, while he did work for a lumber company, he did so not as a laborer. He owned the lumber company. That is, he was one of its partners. Yet when he arrived on the plateau, he was only 20 years old. Now here's the lumber company stationery. And I know you can't read it, but he's listed both as an officer and as a director. And if you could read this salutation, this letter is written to my adorable Catherine. And that was the woman in Santa Fe whom he eventually married. But more about her in a moment. So how did we find Brook's actual story? It was from a wonderful gift that we received from his descendants after we published the Homestead book. 2 journals, love letters from Brook to his fiancée, and many, many photographs. The story begins in Jacksonville, Illinois. And in contrast to David Romero, Harold Brook was not a local. He was a city boy born in Jacksonville the day after Christmas in 1885. And he was thrust into responsibility at a very early age. I have mentioned that Brook had TB. We have discovered that his father also had TB and died at that age, of TB, of that disease, died of that disease at 38. And Brook was only 10. And then further tragedy visited the family. 6 years later, when Brook's only sibling, his younger brother, also died. Perhaps the cause also was TB. We simply don't know. But that left Harold Brook at age 16 as the surviving child of his widow mother, Martha Brook, known as Betty, and tubercular himself, left him as the man of the family. Fortunately, Brook's uncle, his father's brother, also lived in Jacksonville, and we know from Brook's later letters that his Uncle Harry played an important part in his life. We're not quite sure, if you notice the headdresses, we're not quite sure what's going on in this photo. Knowing that he would need to support himself and his mother as well, he enrolled in the class of 1907 at the Illinois College of Agriculture in Jacksonville at age 18. But by 1906, he had dropped out of college, never to return. Why did he do that? And where did he go? That was our mystery. Well, his 1906 journal offers tantalizing clues. He was in New Mexico. This is one of the journals that was given to us by descendants, of course, after we published the Homestead book. And as we read through this journal, we find that Brook is traveling south through the state by horseback and train, interviewing people as he moves from community to community. But why? Gradually it became clear that Brook was gathering information for one B.S. Phillips, who appeared to be an entrepreneur looking for investments in mining or agriculture or lumbering. And Phillips instructs Brook to scout the southern part of our state for him, while he himself scouts the state north of Albuquerque. And so, fast forwarding through the journal, we come to our eureka moment. And Here it is, from Brook's 1906 journal, August 16, 1906. Received telegram from Mr. Phillips and started in an hour for Albuquerque. Arrived Albuquerque at 6:45 p.m. and talked over the Ramon deal with Mr. Phillips. Here at last was the evidence that explained how young Harold Brook came to the Pajarito Plateau. It was not 1908, the year that he applied for a homestead. It was 2 years earlier, in the late summer of 1906. Further cryptic entries show the flurry of activity that ensued after Brook met Phillips in Albuquerque. And soon we learned what the Ramon deal was. From his journal, discussed the arrangements and plans and drew up incorporation papers, came to Santa Fe in the afternoon and closed the deal in the evening, selected officers, and the next day wrote Uncle Harry and the others. He was writing them to ask for money. As we learned, Brook and Phillips and several others, including Robert and James McDougall from Iowa, and remember, Robert McDougall and his wife were the close-by neighbors of David Romero. They are buying the Ramon Vigil grant from the estates of the deceased Midwestern owners. And why have they bought the Ramon Vigil grant? Because they intend to start a lumber company, which they named the Ramon Land and Lumber Company. So now we know. Brook was not here because of his TV. He was not here to homestead. He was here to make his fortune in timber. And Brook and Phillips and their partners built their headquarters and a sawmill in Pajarito Canyon. This is now where TA-18 is. Here's Los Alamos, White Rock, and they built their lumber company right there, which of course is now behind the fence. And here's a rare photo of the canyon during the lumber company years. Brook lived at the lumber company for 2 years before he became a homesteader. At first, Brook's and his partners' hopes for the lumber company ran high. And this photo was taken at the site of the lumber camp. The quote on this slide, "I am sure that I overestimate liabilities and underestimate resources," is from a long, detailed letter dated January 14, 1907, from Brook to Uncle Harry. In it, Brook, quoting facts and figures, defends his confidence in the ultimate success of the lumber company. He also says he's been criticized for not producing his first assessment of $1,000, which he is borrowing from Uncle Harry, who is being slow in sending it. But young Brook and his partners soon ran into trouble. Exactly a year from the time the Ramon Land and Lumber Company was incorporated, this comment appeared in the Santa Fe, New Mexican. Quote, "Very little merchantable lumber is being sawed at the present time, owing to the slump in price of the product." The partners began to experience cash flow problems almost immediately. They took various steps to stop their losses, but were unsuccessful. And then a second disaster. In late December 1910, the owners of the Ramon Land and Lumber Company were discovered to have been cutting timber outside the boundaries of the Ramon Vigil grant. Were they doing that deliberately, or was there a problem with the boundary? We have no idea. On January 14, 1911, 2 suits were filed by the creditors against the Ramon Land and Lumber Company, and by January 26, despite efforts to stave off bankruptcy, the company defaulted on its contract. And this photo is of the Pajarito site. We think it is of the lumber company. But the year 1911, when the lumber company defaulted, was not a complete disaster for Brook. It appears that during his many treks to Santa Fe, it took 7 hours, by the way, to get from here to there, where he had to go to meet with the bank and lawyers. He met this young widow, Catherine Lucy Cross Brown. She was known to her friends as Cassie, and she was the daughter of a journalist and an editor, a one-time editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican. She had married Frank Brown on the last day of December 1907, and 3 years later, Frank Brown died of TB. Cassie was 22 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant with their son. Now, if we had more time, we could follow their courtship through the letters that the two wrote each other, in which Cassie worried about Brook's health. Quote, "No one knows better than I what you are facing," she wrote, referring to his tuberculosis. And on his part, Brook worried that Cassie didn't understand just how difficult and unromantic ranching was. But nonetheless, after 3 years, Cassie and Brook were married in 1914. He was 28, she was 26. We don't have a photo of the wedding, but here are the newlyweds. Cassie and a young Frank moved to Brook's Los Alamos ranch, where both, despite Brook's fears, adapted wonderfully. Cassie is also the young woman in the cave with the pistol on the cover of the Homestead book. And young Frank, here he is with his burro with the Brook house in the background. Brook now had not only his mother, but a wife and a stepson to support, and his health was worsening. Ranching was becoming harder for him to do. We have a chilling account of Brook in 1916 when a visitor reported, "My first sight of him at the ranch was threshing out beans with the aid of a gasoline engine, there by the new barn, sweating, dust-covered, and spitting blood on the discarded vines." Brook was now under pressure to supplement his income and to keep his Los Alamos ranch running while doing less of the hard work himself. As it happened, the same year that Brook and Cassie married, 1914, the Ramon Vihil grant came into Brook's life once again. After the failure of Brook's lumber company, the grant was bought by Ashley Pond and his partners, industrialists from Detroit. And there, with Pond, their man on the spot, the industrialists developed a private club as a rustic retreat for wealthy businessmen, the Pajarito Club. The club remodeled the original lumber company buildings, and Brook, his TB worsening, became involved. Beginning around 1915, while still running their Los Alamos ranch, Brook and Cassie served as general manager and hostess at the Pajarito Club. And here they are. Here's Cassie and here's Brook, and they're in the living room down at Pajarito Canyon of the Pajarito Club, and that is Ashley Pond. And in addition, in what was becoming a last-ditch effort to support his family as his health worsened, Brook also started a cattle-raising operation, and he created the Cliff Cities Pack Outfitters. But in 1916, realizing that he could not continue ranching, he entered into a partnership with Ashley Pond, who in the meantime had been bought out of the Pajarito Club by the Eastern Partners. And Brook and Pond decided to start a boys' school on the grounds of Brook's homestead. But by September 1916, the two men had fallen out with each other. So Brook sold his Los Alamos ranch to Pond, and by March 1917, he and Cassie had left the plateau. Brook never saw Fuller Lodge, shown here, which became the heart of the Los Alamos Ranch School, as you know. Now, here ends the tale of Harold Brook as it pertains to the Homestead era. And I should stop here, but I imagine you might be interested in what happened to Brook after he left the plateau. So I'll take just a few minutes to sum up those years briefly. Brook's expanded family moved to Las Cruces, and 2 months later, Cassie gave birth to twin daughters. Brook became the county agent, the county agriculture agent at Las Cruces, and he also served as president of the Elephant Butte Irrigation District. And noted for his energy and his ambition, he was even asked to run as a Republican candidate for governor of New Mexico. But sadly, Brook's TB grew worse, and only 7 years after he and Cassie moved to Las Cruces, he lost his life to TB. On January 5th, 1924, he had just turned 38, 10 days earlier. He and Cassie had only 10 years together. She outlived him by 48 years, supporting her son and her twin daughters by working for the post office in Las Cruces. She died in 1972 in Whittier, California, where she had moved to be close to her daughters. Harold Brook, his wife Cassie, and his mother Mattie were long gone from the plateau when life here changed abruptly in late 1942 when the Army took over the ranch school and the homesteads. This is that famous letter from the Army. David Romero had died by then, but Francisquita still owned the David Romero homestead, and Victor still owned his, although sometime after the mid-1930s, the Romeros ceased farming on their tracts. And this is the last view we have of the plateau before the war and the Army changed everything. This one, of course, is looking west, and here is the ranch school, which was once part of Brook's homestead. And so came the end of both the homestead era and the ranch school era on the plateau. So I want to just sum up briefly by asking, what have we learned by examining the stories of David Romero and Harold Brook? And did either of them fulfill the intent of the Homestead Act? And I think the first thing we can conclude is that both took advantage of the act to achieve their particular needs, and that these needs differed significantly. As a result, the two men differed in the reasons they homesteaded, the expectations they had, the way they farmed their homesteads, and how they regarded the land. They both shared the same place, the plateau, and they both faced the same challenges presented by the plateau's semi-arid environment, yet one persisted and the other did not. Remember that in the last quarter of the 19th century, America experienced rapid industrialization, and Harold Brook was an energetic and ambitious young man with dreams. He came from a culture that valued progress and individualism, and for him, the plateau was a place that could be exploited to fulfill his dreams. Homesteading was incidental to his reasons for being here. It was just an adjunct to what he really wanted to do. His first priority was the lumber company, which he thought would be his principal source of wealth. And when it failed, he turned his energies to creating a commercial ranch by taking advantage of the Homestead Act. He was an eager entrant into the world of capitalism. But Brook's ambitions exceeded the possibilities. He overextended himself financially and physically. And on top of all, we must not forget that he was fighting an ultimately fatal disease. Unlike Brook, David Romero was not an outsider to the plateau. He spent his entire life amidst it, in the heart of the Hispano homeland. His roots to the plateau and the Rio Grande Valley extended back for generations. Over the centuries, his people had adjusted to the environment of the valley and the plateau. They had stamped it with their culture and customs. They had learned how to survive in it. They had shaped it. And the result was the creation of a very strong sense of place that tied David to the land by family and friends, culture, church, language, and personal history. He did not demand of his homeland more than he knew it could provide. He had grown up in a barter society. He was comfortable with that way of life and with time-honored ways of doing things. He simply used the Homestead Act to regain a part of what he once had. And he was blessed with good health and a long lifespan. He was a survivor. Certainly, neither man helped to open up the West by homesteading, but both men, in their various ways, small and large, changed the face of that part of the plateau where they lived. And so their legacies live on in a way, I think, that would surprise them both greatly if they could return. I hope by telling you their stories, I have demonstrated that homesteading here did in fact differ significantly from the stereotype of the national homesteading experience. And not only that, I hope I have demonstrated that within the plateau itself, homesteading was not a uniform experience. And last of all, I hope I have brought the homestead era here on the plateau alive for you through my tale of two homesteaders. Think of David Romero and Harold Brook as you live your lives here on what was once their home. Thank you. Yes, if anyone has questions?
Questions?
Could you please tell me where David Romero is buried?
Yes, at San Ildefonso.
It's in Ildefonso and not at Milwaukee.
Correct.
Okay.
That is our belief, and that headstone is at San Ildefonso.
Thank you.
There's one over here.
Judy, can you tell us a little bit more about how you got possession of the letters?
It was one of those wonderful moments when someone knocked on the door of our archives, and actually it happened twice. Both times, the person who knocked at the door was one of Brook's grandsons. They both live in California. One is a history professor in Fresno, the other is in the Bay Area, and makes his living going on cruises to the Pacific, where he has a group of dancers and musicians, and they do Hawaiian, Polynesian dances. At any rate, they're both terrific men, and they came in separately on 2 different times and brought us these journals, the letters, and almost 100 photos. That was just a great discovery. Of course, it was after we published the book.
Did they bring them to Los Alamos because they heard about them?
Yes, and apparently they had been here. I mean, they knew their history. They had each brought their families here, as I understand it, several times over the years. And in some cases, they gave us these documents and photos. In other cases, they asked to have them returned, which we did. We copied them and gave them back. So,
Neat talk. Thank you for that.
you will.
When you describe what happened after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that prevented the locals from coming up here and using this as commons, I understand it in principle, but was there an authority that actually actively prevented them, or was it just an understanding that it was not legal?
I don't think there was an authority. You know, the plateau was really quite remote in those days. It took, as I mentioned, at least 7 hours to get here from Santa Fe. And not only were the Hispano homesteaders who believed they were descendants of the Sanchez's, not only were they using the Ramon Villa grant, but when the surveyors came through in the 1890s, and you know, you couldn't homestead until land had been surveyed, they saw signs of squatters. They saw cabins, they saw fields. So that outside the Ramon Villa grant owned the main part of the plateau. So that's clear that people were using it as they always had. They weren't, there was nobody, as far as we could tell.
You have a question?
Where did they cross the river?
Where did
Well-
they cross the river?
You know, we have tried to find out. Now, obviously, from the time of Buckman on, there was a bridge, but you mean before that? You're asking before that? What I have been told by native people from San Ildefonso, current people who are living here, working at the lab, was that there was a ford somewhere from the western edge of San Ildefonso, crossing the Rio there, where it was shallow enough at some time to pull a wagon over at least ride. And then they thought that at times the Indians would make it shallower, so to speak, by adding sand and dirt to it. But we have never found a definitive answer. They got across somehow. We know
That's
they
because
did.
in the spring it'd be high water.
Yeah, right. Just when they would need to come up. So. However, Chick, one addition. The earliest homesteaders, the Garcias, they lived in Huachapangue, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, south of it, just south of Española, which was on the west side of the Rio anyway. So they didn't have to worry about crossing the river. Okay. All right.
There's at least 4 great-grandchildren of David Romero here.
Right here in the audience? Oh, would you stand up?
Welcome, it is wonderful to have you here. Whenever we show off the Romero cabin, we always talk about Ray and Severo helping us make sure that it's authentic, and so, thank you. All right, one more question.
Judy, one more connection with the Brook family is Cassie Brown's son continued with the name Brown. And he grew up and became the manager after World War II of the Zia Company here in Los Alamos. So he had, we knew his, some of us grew up with his kids. And then they went back to Las Cruces as well. So I think that's also what brought them up to bring documents up here.
Thank you. That's right. Thank you very much for your attention. I enjoyed sharing the story.